I'd really like to take time to introduce our first morning keynote. Talia Moore is a postdoctoral research fellow in ecology and evolutionary in the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology Department at the University of Michigan, and has spent the past 10 years working in biomechanics and bioinspiration. She recently completed her PhD in organismic evolutionary biology at the Harvard University Concord Field Station, where she studied the convergent evolution and biomechanics of bipedal rickettsial locomotion in desert rodents. For her graduate research, she caught and studied hopping rodents on 3 continents and established quantitative methods for characterizing non-steady state locomotion. Prior to her graduate studies, she worked at UC Berkeley in the polymetal lab, where she discovered tail-assisted pitch control in terrestrial lizards and studied the effect of mass distribution on dynamic stability in cockroaches. She has been published in journals such as Nature, Biological Cybernetics, Current Biology, and the Integrative and Comparative Biology Journal. Her collaborations with roboticists and engineers have been presented at conferences such as the IEEE Engineering in Medicine and Biology, the IEEE International Conference on Biomedical Robotics, and Biomechatronics and Dynamic Walking. Please welcome Talia Moore.
Hi, thanks so much for having me here today for Robotics Day, especially because I am not a roboticist. But I'm trying to talk to you today about how I've been working for my whole career with engineers and roboticists to make these mutually interesting bio-inspired robots that inform us both about evolutionary biology and about robotics. So the first thing I want to tell you about today is what is an evolutionary hypothesis and why is it important to understand evolutionary hypotheses. And I'm going to use the example of the cane toad. So the cane toad is a toad that is native to Central and South America, and it was brought over to Australia in 1935 to eat the cane grub. Now these grubs eat sugarcane, and sugarcane is a really important crop in Australia. And they said, okay, we know that the cane toad eats grubs in Central and South America, so let's bring it over to Australia to control this problem. But because they didn't understand the evolutionary history and the adaptation of this cane toad in its natural habitat, and they didn't understand the differences between the natural habitat of Central and South America and Australia, they ran into a few problems. First of all, adaptation to a mainland habitat really made the cane toad a fierce predator in Australia, or a fierce competitor in Australia. And here's an example of how that happened. So this is a native Australian frog, and the native Australian frog eggs occur in this foamy substance that's really prone to drying out and desiccation. So this means that they are they're limited to these swampy areas where they know they're going to have consistent water. The cane toad eggs, on the other hand, come in these strings that are kind of goopy, and they don't dry out very easily at all. And that means that they can travel to these places where the native Australian frogs and toads can't go, where maybe the water isn't as consistently available. Another thing is that the cane toad in Central and South America evolved in conjunction with these fierce predators. This is a broad-snouted caiman. And because it had many predators in Central and South America, the cane toad evolved these toxic poison glands. And so anytime one of the predators chomps down on the cane toad, it shoots this toxin out of its glands, killing the predator. Now, Australian native frogs and toads don't have these toxic venom glands, so when a natural predator of an Australian frog, like this cute and fuzzy native marsupial quoll, goes to eat one of these cane toads, they end up dead. And this is why they're endangered right now. And not only are the predators of native Australian frogs and toads suffering because of this invasive species, but it's also the tiny, tiny marsupials that are at risk as well, because the cane toads are much more fierce predators than the native Australian frogs and toads. So they ran into some of these problems, and they noticed that, these cane toads are kind of taking over. And it turns out that from one pond in 1935 up until 2008, the cane toads were able to make it to this brown line here. And ecologists and evolutionary biologists predict that they'll be able to make it into all of the shaded areas in green. So they're pretty much taking over all of Australia, and it's one of the largest threats to the natural environment that Australia has faced in the past century. And this is all because they didn't understand how the cane toads had adapted to their natural habitat in Central and South America. So let's talk about adaptation for a moment. Adaptation and adaptive evolution is this really intuitive idea where you see an animal in its natural habitat and you think, wow, it looks like it really is well suited for living in that environment. It must have some traits that have evolved that allow it to survive better in its environment, right? So let's take, for example, this sea lion, right? The sea lion has this really sleek body form, and it seems really hydrodynamic. But even though adaptation is this concept that's really easy to intuitively understand, it's very hard to demonstrate these functional relationships between form and evolutionary fitness, right? So, for example, if we were to take the sea lion and we wanted to say, okay, how does the body form help it survive in water? We would have to vary the body form in the same environment, and then we would have to take the sea lion and put it in a bunch of different environments. Now that first one, varying the body form, is not really possible with the diversity of life that we have right now. There may be extinct animals that match these variations in body form. And putting an animal in different natural habitats may not actually be ethical or good for the animal. And so we can't then use these experiments to understand how the animal is surviving in its natural habitat. But this is where I think bio-inspired robotics can come in and save the day. So if we look at this Venn diagram of overlapping interests between engineering and biology, biology has a lot of these ideas that they want to figure out that are kind of biomechanical, like how did the T-Rex run? How did bipedality evolve in humans? How did fish go from water to land, and how did flight evolve in birds from dinosaurs, right? And these are ideas that are very evolutionary and really can help us understand how we evolved on this planet and help us understand how we're going to evolve in spite of climate change or any kind of large changes in our environment in the future. On the other hand, we have these engineering interests and these bio-inspired robots that have taken one specific trait in an animal and then made a robot that exemplifies that trait. However, there's no guarantee that that trait is the trait that is key to the animal's survival in the natural habitat. And so for the past 10 years, my career has been about being in this overlapping area where we have mutually interesting bio-inspired robots that do test the evolutionary hypotheses by exemplifying the trait that is helping these animals survive in their natural habitats. So how do we use robots to test these evolutionary hypotheses? Well, I'm going to go through two examples. The first example, does this trait have a function? I'm going to take an example of an animal, and we're going to examine a trait, and we're going to use a robot to test its function. Then I'm going to see whether or not this increases fitness. This functional trait, does it increase fitness, and does it help an animal survive in the wild? So for our first example, we've got a velociraptor. So in the 60s, there was a paleontologist that noticed that the velociraptor's tendons in its tail, so right in there, are ossified, meaning that they have turned to bone. And this is really unusual in animals, especially terrestrial animals. And he hypothesized that if they've turned to bone, it's probably happening because they're under a lot of stress, and maybe it has some function as a dynamic stabilizer. As the velociraptor's moving around, maybe the tail helps it move. And this theory gained in popularity, and it's actually been shown in Jurassic Park. If you look at this movie and you watch the paleontologist running away from the velociraptor, and you watch the velociraptor jump, it brings its tail up as it jumps. So Steven Spielberg is kind of on the same page. So we decided that we were going to test this hypothesis. Now, we don't have any velociraptors lying around, but we do have these terrestrial lizards called the agama lizards. And these are lizards that run around on these rocky terrains in Africa. And they jump from rock to rock. So we put them in this racetrack where they were able to jump off of a block onto a vertical surface and then into a dark covered area, which is where they like to hang out. And we found that we were able to reliably get them to jump off of the block and then go onto a vertical surface. This is what they really like to do all the time. So they've got this block, and then they bring their body pitch up so that they can land on this vertical surface well, right? And this is really great, and we notice that they really have to rotate their body to stick this landing. But something happened. If you'll notice, this is sandpaper right here, and it's high friction. We decided to remove the friction and make it a slippery surface, and this did something pretty wild. The animal slips, and instead of taking a nosedive like you and I would, it brings its tail up to maintain the body position and stick the landing. So this is because when you're in the air, your total angular momentum has to remain 0. So if your tail comes up and creates this motion, your body also has to come up to cancel it out. And so we thought, hey, maybe these animals are recovering from this perturbation. Instead of taking a nosedive, they're maintaining their body pitch, and they're using their tail to control their body pitch. So we did this a few times, and as we did it more and more, the lizards actually learned, and they were able to redirect their forces as they were jumping so that they didn't slip at all, even if it's a slippery surface. So what did we do? We gave them friction back again. And we found that they overshot. So this is the first trial with more friction, and we found that their body pitch was too high, and they had to bring their tail down to make a horizontal landing because they were too high up. And we found that this happened pretty reliably. We did a whole bunch of different types of perturbation, and we found a lot of different types of body angle changes. But we found that the tail angle changes actually varied very predictably with the body perturbation. And so we thought, hey, maybe there's a general principle here. We measured the moment of inertia of the tail. We measured the moment of inertia of the body. We thought, okay, maybe there's something here that's a fundamental biomechanical principle instead of just some weird behavioral thing that the animal does for no reason. So we decided to test this hypothesis with a robot. So this is Tailbot. It's a modified RC car. It uses its front wheels for propulsion, and it has a motor in the back that is used to actuate this tail. And this tail is modular. It can be removed completely, it can be held rigid, it can be compliant, or it can be active, right? And when it's active, the robot uses a gyroscope to sense angular velocity, and it uses PD control to move the tail. All right, so let's test this out. We decided to run the robot off of a ramp so that it has a pitch up, like a nose up position when it goes. And with a passive compliant tail, even though it starts in a nose up position, it takes a nosedive and it can't stick a landing. But then we decided to test it with an active tail. We turned on the controller, and we found that the robot was able to maintain this pitch up position, and it made a perfect landing every time. And this correction was done in 150 milliseconds without any body oscillation, so it's pretty robust. And we tested all 4 modes of this tailbot, and we found that, yeah, these active tails are the most effective, and the tailless robot is least effective. So we thought, hey, maybe we really do have a principle here, like an underlying fundamental principle of inertial maneuvering. So we decided to go back to the velociraptor. And we can't like CT scan or measure the different moments of inertia of a velociraptor because they're not around anymore. But what we can do is, based on our understanding of the density of bone and the density of muscle, and do this reconstruction, we can build a model of the mass distribution of a velociraptor. And based on that mass distribution model, we can predict how effective the tail will be at inducing a pitch moment. And what we found was, when we compared a teeny tiny tail bot and then the lizard, the dinosaur is more effective than the lizard at using its tail to control the body pitch. And this is really interesting because it means that these dinosaurs are capable of this inertial maneuvering even though they're terrestrial. It was previously thought that inertial maneuvering was only useful in aerial animals. And this has been really useful for the robotics field. So after this paper was published, there have been a slew of robots out there that have incorporated tails for inertial maneuvering, whether it's to induce jumping, to induce a turn, to recover from a perturbation, or to make these awesome flips in the air. But not only has it been useful for engineering, it's actually been really useful for biology as well. So like I said, we only thought about inertial maneuvering in arboreal animals before, but now we've been looking at it in terrestrial animals and looking at inertial maneuverings in structures that we had never thought to look at before. So even though the bat uses its wings for aerodynamic motion, it actually uses inertial maneuvering because the wings are so heavy with respect to the body. Same with the abdomen of the hawk moth, and the praying mantis actually uses inertial maneuvering when it leaps for a strike. And this inertial maneuvering also makes a lot of sense with respect to how we understand the body posture of T-Rexes now. So we used to think that T-Rexes were kind of upright, like a human, with its tail often dragging on the floor. But what we realize now is that because these animals use their tails for inertial maneuvering, the animals have a much more horizontal position and can probably induce turns with their tail very quickly. So we've come up with this way to test the function of a trait. But now I'm going to go through and describe a project that I'm currently doing that goes from the trait to the function and then all the way to the fitness. So in the deserts around the world, you have these small bipedal hopping rodents. They're about the size of your fist, and they have very long legs, very long tails, and very big eyes because they're crepuscular. They live and they hang out only at twilight, right? And one possibility for how you can get 3 different types of bipedal rodents living in these deserts is if they had a common ancestor that was bipedal, that lived somewhere, and then it spread out to all of these different continents and then continued to be bipedal in these deserts. The other possibility is that each of these bipedal rodents evolved to be bipedal in that desert independently. And that would be really interesting because if that were the case, then this gives us a really big clue that bipedal locomotion may be particularly useful for locomotion in the desert environments. And so the way that we answered this question was using a family tree. So I used genetics to create a family tree of rodents. And I found that these bipedal rodents here in red all independently evolved bipedality. They're actually more closely related to a beaver in some cases than they are to each other. So this gives us a hint that this bipedal locomotion may be really useful for desert environments. So then I asked the question, why does bipedal locomotion evolve? Well, one thing we know really well is locomotion in kangaroos. People have been able to study kangaroos for several years. And we know that kangaroos have really low cost of transport. Right here, they have low muscle contribution and high tendon energy recovery. Now, what does that mean? It means that these animals can go for a long time at a single speed without spending too much energy. And this is because their tendons are very resilient. They're like a rubber band, so if you stretch them, they want to snap back. And so if this is your leg, and this is your foot, and you want to point your toe, which is something you would do during locomotion, right? And this is your muscle, and this is your tendon. If you want to point your toe, you're going to contract your muscle, and your muscle is going to stretch this tendon, and it's also going to deflect this foot. And by stretching this tendon, you're actually storing energy passively inside of this tendon that's going to be bounced back into the next step you take. And that's really useful if you're maintaining speed and you're having steady state locomotion like a kangaroo is. So I wanted to know if this is happening in the small bipedal rodents. And so I performed inverse dynamics calculations on a few jerboas, which are these small bipedal rodents that are native to Egypt that we happen to have a colony of in the lab. And the way that inverse dynamics works is you use the ground reaction forces and you measure the moment arms, and you find out using the muscle architecture and the muscle tendon architecture how much force each muscle is producing and how much energy each tendon is storing and recovering. And you can figure out exactly what components are contributing to this motion. So the only thing you can get a jerboa to do reliably is jump straight up, and they can jump more than 10 times their hip height. And what I found was initially that the jerboas, if this is their foot, these are just their toes. This is their foot, so that's their ankle, that's their knee, and that's their hip. Most of the work in creating this jump happens at the midfoot and the ankle joint. But then if we look at tendon energy storage, we've got these very cursorial animals up here that have a low cost of transport, like dogs and kangaroos and ostriches. And the jerboa is down here at the very, very low tendon energy contribution to their locomotion. And this is actually the lowest tendon energy contribution that's been measured in a mammal. Now, why on earth would it be useful to have low tendon energy contribution if it's so great for your cost of transport to store energy in your tendons? Well, let's take a look. If we come back to this and we see that there is, a certain amount of deflection that happens with a certain amount of muscle contraction, in a ricochettal animal like these small bipedal rodents, you have to contract your muscle much less to get the same amount of deflection because the tendons are really stiff. So these tendons aren't stretching at all, and they're barely storing any energy. And this means that you have more direct transmission of forces from your muscle to your foot. And that means you're better able to accelerate, decelerate, and change directions very, very quickly. So that basically means you're specialized for maneuverability, right? So it turns out that we have this dynamic trade-off in bipedal locomotion. We know that kangaroos are cursorial. They can go on forever and ever and ever. They have this low cost of transport, and they're very economical, whereas jerboas are ricochettal. They have high muscle contribution, low tendon energy recovery, and this high cost of transport, but this is highly maneuverable. Now, this is really interesting because if you take a look at this plot where you have cost of transport on this axis and body mass on this axis, you can see that there are a lot of very economical animals around here, and the robots that are being made right now are driving towards a lower and lower and lower cost of transport. But my challenge to you, the roboticists of the future in this room, is to take a look up here at this high cost of transport but high maneuverability regime, where if you have a really small robot, you may be able to get something that's highly maneuverable and is capable of interesting locomotion that is not capable in this regime. Now, why would that be useful? Well, these are desert animals, right? And did anyone remember the Mars rover that got stuck on Mars? It just kept digging itself deeper and deeper and deeper because of its wheels. Well, my challenge to you out there is to take a look at these desert rodents and build a Mars rover based on these desert rodents instead, because I bet you they'll be much better at navigating the sandy terrain than a wheeled robot. So I've told you about how we find the function of a trait in these rodents, but now let's talk about finding the fitness. So given that these rodents are more specialized for maneuverability, what is the goal? Like, how does that help this animal? Well, one thing you should know is that each of these bipedal rodents live with quadrupedal rodents in the same habitat. They eat the same food and they have the same predators. And the predators are actually pretty key to this equation. So I think, and a lot of other scientists also think, that bipedal locomotion may have evolved to help these bipedal rodents evade predators. But maneuverability doesn't directly correspond to predator evasion. And this is kind of a subtle idea here. There's a difference between maneuverability and unpredictability. So maneuverability is your intrinsic capability, whereas unpredictability is your behavioral utilization of your capability. I like to say that it's a difference between what's in a car and who's driving the car, right? And this is really important because a predator is not going to be attacking you based on what you could potentially be doing. They're going to attack you based on what you're actually doing. So if you're an owl, which is one of the natural predators of these animals, and you're watching this quadrupedal rodent here that's very predictable, and you say, okay, I need to hunt this animal. I'm going to watch the animal, and then I'm going to plot an intercept trajectory, because I know how long it's going to take for me to get there and how long it's going to take for him to get there. And you plot an intercept course and you get dinner, right? But if your prey is unpredictable, like this jerboa here, and you watch the jerboa, and you say, okay, I know how long it's going to take for it to get to where we're going to meet up. And then you go for it, this jerboa may move in an unpredictable manner and escape your predation attempt, right? So unpredictability may be really key to predator evasion, and we found a way to measure unpredictability. So this is an entropy equation, and you can ask me about it afterwards, but what you need to know here is that H is unpredictability, it's also entropy, and when H is high, you are very unpredictable, and when H is low, you are more predictable. And we measure entropy based on these probability distributions. So you have a bunch of different states here, so these could be velocities or directions of movement, and we have a frequency associated with each of these states. And so if you do the same thing all the time, you're probably really predictable, and that means you have a very pointy distribution and you have low H, right? And if you are very unpredictable, you probably do a lot of different things with equal probability. And the flatter your distribution, the more unpredictable you're going to be, and the higher your entropy, right? So I wanted to know if these bipedal rodents, when they're being under this predation stress, do they move more unpredictably than quadrupedal rodents do? So I went out into the field. I went to this desert area in Xinjiang, China, and they have one species of quadrupedal jerd and two species of bipedal jerboa there. And I took them out into the field, I caught them there, I built a little setup there, a little enclosed area, and I simulated predation. So mostly I just tried to scare them a little bit during their normally active hours of the day. And this is a jerd, it's quadrupedal, it's moving around here. And these are taken, because they're crepuscular, they're taken at twilight or at night, and they're illuminated with IR light. Okay, so that was a quadrupedal jerd, and this is a bipedal jerboa. There's kind of a big difference there, right? But people have been talking about these big differences in their locomotion for a long time, but no one's ever quantified them. So I tracked their trajectories in 3D, and then I measured the entropy of these three-dimensional trajectories. And I found that there is actually a significant difference between the bipedal jerboas and the quadrupedal jerd, but surprisingly, I also found a big difference between the two species of bipedal jerboa. Now, how does this work? How do they create this unpredictable movement? Well, by doing this calculation, we also get these really great low-dimensional projections which give us these distributions that help us describe their motion. So this is their speed, and the quadrupedal jerd is in blue here. And you can see it's a very pointy distribution and it uses very low speeds. And the jerboas, they use more high speeds more frequently. Not only do they differ in their speeds, but they also differ in their direction of motion. So on this globe, the colored areas indicate how frequently you are going to move in that direction. So the quadrupedal gird moves forward and backward, pretty much no turning. The bipedal jerboa in green tends to turn a little bit more, and the bipedal jerboa in red almost exclusively is turning all the time. So here, with this equation and with this analysis, I've shown both that these jerboas move more unpredictably, but also how they move more unpredictably. But I haven't yet showed you whether or not this helps them survive predation attempts. And so I tried to do this myself a little bit, where we ran out into the desert and we tried to catch a jerboa. It's pretty difficult. But we're not the natural predators of these jerboas, right? So what would an experiment look like in which I tested the ability of unpredictable locomotion to deter predation, right? An ideal experiment. Well, ideally, I'd like to have maybe a fenced-off area of desert. I'd like to have 50 quadrupedal rodents, 50 bipedal rodents, and an owl. And I'd love to track their movements during each of the predation attempts. But this is not ethical. Those rodents are going to suffer, right? And I don't want to be responsible for that suffering. So again, this is where bio-inspired robots come to the rescue. So it's pretty common for falconers, people who have, red-tailed hawks, peregrine falcons, they exercise their birds using mechanical lures. And these are basically like dead rats on a motorized fishing rod, right? They get reeled in really quickly, and the birds will hunt them. And this is standard practice for falconry. And so I, like you do, I made friends with a red-tailed hawk, and his name's Dipper, and I decided to work with a high school student to create my own mechanical lure. And what we're going to do is we're going to change the entropy of the trajectories that the mechanical lure takes. So if we've got our dead rat here, and we've got this motor that will turn and reel in this rat, we can put spools on the ground to change how many times the lure changes direction. So we can go from something that's pretty predictable to something that's pretty unpredictable, and then measure the success of the bird every time it tries to catch one of these things. Now, this is a pretty simple robot, but I would argue that the ideas that we're talking about here are actually pretty interesting. How do we generate unpredictable motion, right? How do we go from a robot that just goes and takes a few steps forward in a straight line to something that moves a little bit more like this? And I think that you, the roboticists of the future, are going to have to develop new types of controls, new types of dynamics, and new types of materials that are going to make these robots that are going to be capable of unpredictable locomotion, highly maneuverable locomotion, and are going to be able to do all kinds of tasks that we can't even imagine right now. So this is how I approach the collaboration between biology and bioinspiration. We talk about traits and functions, and we talk about how that increases fitness. And I hope that instead of having this teeny tiny little sliver of overlapping interests, that my work and hopefully your work in the future will expand this area of mutually interesting bio-inspired robotics. So thank you very much for having me, and good luck with the future.